Robin Williams, the U.S. Actor and comedian, developed this dementia with Lewy bodies, very disturbing disease. It might affect up to 1 million Americans. I think it's the second leading cause of dementia in the world. So the fundamental thing is that Parkinson's is preventable.
Dr. Ray Dorsey, neurologist.
Is it just a tremor, but it's this stoop posture, the shuffling gait, just a tendency to walk faster and faster and to fall forward that was new. So these toxins, they interact with our body. The two places that they interact with our body is they come in contact either through ingestion or inhalation, leading to a form of the disease that might begin in the body or in the gut in terms of ingestion, or in the nose or the brain in case of inhalation. This chemical, which is widely used in degreasing printers and painters, is estimated that 1 in 12 people in the United Kingdom works with this chemical. It's known to cause cancer and is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. The vast majority of people diagnosed with Parkinson's don't have a family history of the disease.
Hey there, welcome to the Happy Habit Podcast. If you're new around here, I'm Matthew. You'll find me here twice a week, every Monday and Thursday, talking to experts on all things health, well-being and self-improvement. Now, if you're already familiar with this podcast, with some of the over 400 episodes over the last 4 years, and would like to show your support, remember it's free. You can like, subscribe, tell other people who you think might enjoy these episodes too. You can also leave us a positive rating, as many of you have done to date on iTunes and Spotify. And if you're over on YouTube, check us out over there, become a subscriber. You can leave a comment and click that bell notification for any future videos. Now, in a conversation I had a few months ago, I spoke with neurologist Dr Ray Dorsey, all about the subject of Parkinson's disease and cognitive decline. It was so popular an episode that it was downloaded and streamed and viewed thousands and thousands of times. So I thought I would invite him back to the podcast, as there is clearly a huge appetite to discuss things like Parkinson's disease, other forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease and Lewy body dementia, which is the disease to which Robin Williams succumbed only a few years ago. So we talk about Parkinson's disease, how it was discovered, its symptoms, but crucially, why Dr. Dorsey and other experts believe it is a preventable disease. We hear of the environmental factors that Dr. Dorsey believes are causing Parkinson's and other forms of dementia. Those factors include dry cleaning chemicals, emissions from cars, and toxins contaminating our food supply. We learn that only in a small number of cases of Parkinson's are genetics implicated, which further points to factors outside the body that are driving this and other forms of cognitive decline. It is also Dr. Dorsey's belief that contamination by toxins is what is driving the huge spike of cases of autism in recent years. This is another fascinating and highly informative discussion with an expert in his field. Enjoy this conversation with neurologist Dr. Ray Dorsey. Very, very welcome back to the podcast. There was a huge interest in our previous conversation, and for me that suggests there's a huge appetite to find out more about Parkinson's disease. At the outset, can we explain first of all what Parkinson's disease is and the origins of this disease, because they only go back about 200 years?
Yeah, so not too far from where you are standing, a British surgeon, not Irish unfortunately, a British surgeon, Dr. James Parkinson, wrote the first major description of the disease that later bears his name. He wasn't egotistical and didn't name it after himself. A French neurologist, Charcot, named it after him about 40 years later. But he said, I'm seeing something new on the streets of London. He's 61 years old, been practicing medicine or surgery for 30-some years. He's the son of a surgeon. And he says, tremors long since been described. Shakespeare even described people with tremor in the 1500s. But is it just a tremor, but it's a stoop posture, the shuffling gait, this tendency to walk faster and faster and to fall forward that was new. And he described 6 people with the condition, 3 of whom he just simply observed walking the streets of London. And he said this is a condition that's not been classified in the medical literature. And he makes no references to earlier descriptions of the same disease. He doesn't say, 20 years ago I saw a patient that had this, or, Dr. Smith has previously described other people like this. He said this is something essentially new. And what's going on in London in 1817? Well, it's the height of the Industrial Revolution. London's the capital, and the air over London is toxic. It's so bad, it's equivalent to what people breathe in Delhi, India, and Beijing, China on a daily basis. It's akin to what people in North America experienced last summer from the Canadian wildfires when the skies over the Big Apple turned orange. And since that time, research has linked. He didn't know what was causing Parkinson's. He put together a couple of speculations, but really didn't have a great idea of what it was, and he indicated as much. Since that time, numerous research has linked, increasing research has linked air pollution to Parkinson's disease. And so if you think about it, the first place you see the pathology of Parkinson's is largely in the smell center of the brain, so just above the nose. People with Parkinson's have high concentrations of metals in their brain, so many of these metals could be entering the brain by hitchhiking on the pieces of dirt and soot that you can see in smog. And loss of smell is one of the earliest features of the disease. So he could have been describing the chronic effects of exposure to toxic levels of air pollution. And numerous studies since that time have demonstrated that industrialized parts of the world have the highest levels of air pollution, highest levels of Parkinson's disease. Least industrialized areas like sub-Saharan Africa have the lowest, and areas that undergo the most rapid industrialization like China and India have the fastest increasing rates of Parkinson's.
I want to come back to the other environmental factors that we spoke about in our previous interview in a second, but people are really keen to find out more about how this particular disease progresses. Now, you spoke about some of the symptoms there, but how does it progress and how long does it take to progress?
Yeah, so the fundamental thing is that Parkinson's is preventable, and we postulated, let me see if I can pull this up. Can I share a slide with you?
Sure, yeah.
This is still Parkinson's Awareness Month. I don't know if your listeners know, but April is a Parkinson's Awareness Month. World Parkinson's Day was April 11th, which just happens to be Dr. James Parkinson's birthday. And on that day, a really smart Danish scientist, Per Borghammer, and colleagues and I wrote a piece postulating how Parkinson's might begin. And he's postulated that Parkinson's might begin in the nose or the gut, two different forms of the disease, one beginning in the gut, so-called body first Parkinson's disease, and one beginning in the brain, or nose first Parkinson's disease. And he says, we postulate that toxins that you ingest, so like polluted well water, food that has high levels of pesticides in them, might begin with misfolding of this protein called alpha-synuclein in the gut. And that misfolded protein can spread from nerve cell to nerve cell. Some of your listeners might know about prion diseases. So it spreads from nerve cells to nerve cells, kind of like a prion, and it can spread from the gut up to a nerve called the vagus, up through a nerve called the vagus nerve, which connects the brain to the gut and leads to pathology in the vagus nerve. And that can, for example, cause constipation. And then as it spreads up to the other part of the brainstem that's responsible for sleep, people can get sleep disturbances, and then it spreads up to the part of the brain that controls blood pressure, and you can get troubles with low blood pressure. And then it spreads up to the part of the brain that's responsible for the tremor and slowness of the of movements. That part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And then it can spread out to the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking or causing hallucinations. And so that's one way that the disease could spread, beginning in the gut. On the other hand, it could start in the nose, as we alluded to, with like air pollution or inhaled toxin, inhaled pesticides, inhaled dry cleaning chemicals. And it could begin with pathology in one side of the nose, one side of the smell center, and then spread largely restricted to one hemisphere. Most of the connections of nerve cells in the brain are to the same side of the brain. Only 1% of neurons cross over to the other side of the brain. And then quickly, actually, you can go from the smell center, you can go to the substantia nigra with just one pit stop, with like one change of an airplane in an area of the brain called the amygdala. And then it quickly gives people tremor and slowness of movement, usually on one side of the body, certainly on one side of the body, much more than the other side of the body. And then only later gets constipation, only later gets sleep disturbances, and only much later as the disease spreads through both hemispheres do you get problems with dementia and hallucinations. So these toxins, they interact with our body. The two places that they interact with our body is they come in contact either through ingestion or inhalation. leading to a form of the disease that might begin in the body or in the gut in terms of ingestion, or in the nose or the brain in case of inhalation.
So the time frame we're talking about is really a case of years rather than months.
Yeah. So think about, just the good analogies to think about smoking and lung cancer. You don't smoke a cigarette and get cancer the next day or the next year or even generally the next decade. It takes years for those mutations to accumulate in the lung to become into a tumor that grows and becomes uncontrolled. It takes years for the pathology of Parkinson's disease to march its way up from the gut to the brainstem, from the brainstem to the substantia nigra, from the substantia nigra out to the cortices. And it could take generations. So, and we have some clues about this. So many of your listeners may not be familiar, but there's a U.S. Marine base called Camp Lejeune. And their Marines between 1953 and 1987 drank water that was contaminated with this dry cleaning chemical called trichloroethylene. This chemical, which is widely used in degreasing printers and painters, is estimated that 1 in 12 people in the United Kingdom worked with this chemical. It's known to cause cancer and is associated with a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. And the Marines who drank the contaminated water were obviously young, right? They're obviously healthy. So they were on average 20 years old when they were at the Marine base for an average of 2 years. And then 35 years later, on average, they're getting diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Now, some got diagnosed as early as 5 years later, and some as 40 or 45 years later. But I think the health that we have today is a function of our environment in the past. Like if I moved into a polluted area today, my health wouldn't immediately decrease. Maybe my lung thing might decrease, but in general, my brain is not going to be adversely affected that soon. It's what you were exposed to in the past, including what you were exposed to as a child, that likely determines what brain diseases you might develop in the future.
And I think that the revelation for me from our last discussion and again today is that, and I know you were at pains to make this point the last time we spoke, was that Parkinson's isn't just a disease of the brain. As you've mentioned, the gut and the nose are implicated here too. So people need to recognize that and give that the importance that it deserves in order to be able to understand how this disease evolves over these years that you're talking about.
Yeah, and the nice thing is that this disease is preventable. So if you aren't ingesting these toxins, if you aren't inhaling these chemicals, then you are unlikely to develop Parkinson's disease. If you do not get exposed to pesticides, if you don't get exposed to dry cleaning chemicals, if you don't get exposed to high levels of air pollution, I think you're really unlikely to get Parkinson's disease. Another neurologist, Gowers, Sir William Gowers, in 1880s and 1890s wrote the Bible of Neurology, and he was a British neurologist. And he said in his case series, he kept track of all the patients that he had seen with Parkinson's disease. It was either 100 or 200 or so. And he said only 15% of them have a family history of the disease. So we've known for over a century that the vast majority of people diagnosed with Parkinson's disease don't have a family history of the disease. And today, with the advances in genetics, we know that 85% of people with Parkinson's disease have no identifiable genetic risk factor. So people like Michael J. Fox have no identifiable genetic risk factor. The NBA basketball player Brian Grant, no identifiable genetic risk factor. The most prominent people in the field and in the world with the disease in general don't have an identifiable genetic risk factor for the disease.
One of the main questions that I was asked to ask you today was how can we avoid these triggers for Parkinson's? If, for example, we are living in a built-up city with lots of cars, lots of emissions, and if we are purchasing products, for example, that are exposed to these pesticides and the chemicals, we can avoid dry cleaning and being exposed to dry cleaning chemicals. But what about those other triggers? How do we mitigate against exposure to them when it's so very difficult, especially when we're living in a built-up area?
Yeah, so one of my sons is a budding academic. He spent a term in Oxford, and when we were in Oxford, I was like struck, everyone struck with different things, but when you walk the streets in England, you are right next to the car. You're like the bus emits its emissions and you are breathing it in. There have been even studies done in West Virginia where they took a baby in a stroller and showed that the baby in the stroller got exposed to higher levels of air pollution because the baby is lower down and closer to the tailpipe. And so they're getting more exposed to these things. And I think I get really concerned when I see that. I think you could think about what are the designs of cities. You know, do we really want to be right next to the cars and breathing in what cars are emitting through tailpipes? You know, because they know it's unsafe to emit it into the car, so they're emitting it into the atmosphere. Do you want to be right next to it? And I think there's, you know, we talk about air pollution and Parkinson's, and air pollution is even stronger linked to Alzheimer's disease. So I get really, really concerned when I was walking the streets of Oxford, England, about this. So I would think about a little bit where you're walking. That might be hard to do. I think a little bit about car emissions. So in the United States, air pollution in Los Angeles, for example, today is 50 to 90% better than it was in the 1950s, 70s, because we adopted strict air quality standards and air emission standards. So air quality in Los Angeles today is better, even though more people live in Los Angeles, driving more cars, greater distances, and our economy in Los Angeles is better than it ever was. So I think you could have cleaner air and better economy. I think in some ways that a clean air is a prerequisite for a great economy. I mean, who wants to live in Beijing, China? Who wants to live in Delhi, India? So I think we can do things on that. If you live in these areas, and my parents live in Southern California, for Christmas 2 years ago, my children bought them air purifiers. So I would put an air purifier in your home and in your bedroom, in your kitchen, in your bedroom, to decrease your exposure to it. If you're driving in heavily trafficked areas, I would close up your windows, put your air conditioning on, and recirculate the air. So the air is going through filter and you're not drawing in new polluted air into the car. And I forgot the term for organic produce is, what do you guys call it?
We call it that also, yes, organic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So since writing this book, my wife always said we should buy organic. I poo-pooed it. I was ignorant. And since writing the book, I buy organic pretty religiously. And then I wash all my produce and vegetables, even organic ones, with water and basically a pesticide wash or a soap to do it. And then, you know, I rarely dry clean, but I use a dry cleaner that does not use these dry cleaning chemicals that have been implicated in Parkinson's disease. So I think there are dozens of things. We're writing a list of Parkinson's 25 for our next book on 25 things that people could do in their everyday lives to lower their risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And those are just some things people can do.
Another question I was asked to ask you, is it possible to have Alzheimer's at the same time as having Parkinson's?
Yeah, and indeed, and not only is it possible, it's quite common. So when people, scientists look at the brains of people after they die with Parkinson's disease, they often find coexisting Alzheimer's pathology. I tend to think that could be from air pollution. So, you know, you can imagine air pollution could contribute to Parkinson's and contributing to Alzheimer's disease. And we don't have a good idea for why air pollution might lead to Parkinson's in one individual or Alzheimer's in another, or both and both. Turns out there's another disease called dementia with Lewy bodies, which is not only do people get the symptoms of Parkinson's, tremor, slowness of movement, but they get difficulties with memory, hallucinations, and difficulties regulating their blood pressure. And these individuals tend to have a high degree of Alzheimer's pathology in addition to Parkinson's pathology in their brains. And I think it's because Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, to some extent, share similar risk factors, especially around air pollution.
The Lewy body dementia, I believe, is what Robin Williams died as a result of.
Yeah, so Robin Williams, the U.S. Actor and comedian, actually portrayed Oliver Sacks in the movie Awakenings about the treatment of people with a Parkinsonian disorder with levodopa, developed this dementia with Lewy bodies and ended up committing suicide. It's a very disturbing disease. It might affect up to 1 million Americans. I think it's the second leading cause of dementia in the world. And I think, and it's new. So it was first described, I was doing research on this. It was first described, any idea when it was first described?
No.
So it was first described in 1976. First description of dementia with Lewy bodies, the second most common form of dementia in the world, is 1976. That's the first description. The guy, Dr. Kosaka, was a psychiatrist in Japan, and he describes this condition. In the 1980s, he writes a paper talking about dementia with Lewy bodies and asks a new disease, ? So he, just like Dr. Parkinson 160 years earlier, is wondering, am I seeing something new? Because this was, he had not seen it. He had not read about it. He didn't say Dr. Smith described this 40 years ago. He said, this might be something new. And because dementia with Lewy bodies might be more prone to be in the gut, I was wondering what was going on with the water or food supply in Japan in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And it turned out, coming out of World War II, when DDT was used to prevent malaria, Japanese started spraying DDT on the rice paddies. And so the DDT got into the food and water supply, especially, I think, food supply in Japan. And DDT and pesticides like it dissolve in fat. And so you can see levels of DDT in the Japanese general population in their fat increasing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s until the 70s when DDT is banned. My postulation, it's a hypothesis, I could be wrong, it's a little speculation, is that dementia with Lewy bodies is emerging in Japan as a result of exposure to DDT and a class of pesticides called organochlorines that are manifesting themselves for the first time 20 to 30 years after their introduction. Just like we said, you don't get exposed to these pesticides one day and get Parkinson's the next. This is 10, 20, 30 years later. Dr. Kosaka is describing somebody with a new disease.
That's amazing. That's the 1976 discovery of that particular disease is kind of like a canary in the coal mine. That's what I'm thinking. Can I ask you just something else? I'm curious as to find out your opinion on this. Do you think there are any environmental factors implicated in the development of autism in children?
So
it's a loaded question, I understand.
No. So, I'm a neurologist. I care deeply about Parkinson's disease. So when I read, I put blinders on. And so my blinders say Parkinson's disease. And if it doesn't say Parkinson's disease, then I ignore it. Like someone else has got to figure this out. But I keep reading and I keep coming to ALS. I keep coming to Alzheimer's disease. I come to dementia with Lewy body disease. And more recently, I come to autism and intellectual disabilities. And it turns out many of the pesticides that we use, including a pesticide called chlorpyrifos, are nerve toxins. They work by damaging the nervous systems of insects, for example. And the thought is, just like with an antibiotic that will kill bacteria but not human cells, well, there's crossover. It's not so perfect. And that these neurotoxins then don't just damage the nervous systems of insects, but they damage the nervous systems of humans. And so my colleague, Dr. Virginia Rao at Columbia University, has been following children in New York City who were exposed to a pesticide called chlorpyrifos that was found on over half of apples in the United States. So imagine, you were told to eat an apple a day to keep the doctor away. So this pesticide used on over half of apples in the United States. She found that levels, she looked at the blood of the umbilical cord of babies who were born in New York City. And she finds chlorpyrifos in the umbilical cord. So it suggests that the mother was being exposed, for example, widespread use of it to kill insects in apartments in New York City is being passed into the umbilical cord blood. The higher the level of umbilical cord blood, the lower the intellectual performance of children at ages, I think, 3, 5, and 7. So levels of a pesticide in the umbilical cord of children, the higher the level, the worse the academic or intellectual performance of children at ages 3, 5, and 7. So it's clear there's increasing research linking this to intellectual disabilities. And then, to extend that a little bit more, it's been linked to autism. In the United States, at least 1 in 36 children today are born with autism. I get so concerned about the effects of these chemicals in our food, water, and air, about Parkinson's and other brain diseases, that we're organizing a symposium in Washington, D.C. on May 20th on the brain and the environment. And the purpose of the symposium is to highlight how these toxicants in our food, water, and air are contributing to brain diseases from autism to Alzheimer's disease.
We've been talking about prevention. People will be interested to know about cures over and above some of the mitigating steps that you've been talking about, avoiding some of these toxicants. What is the status of research currently as far as Parkinson's is concerned?
I think we're trying to cure a preventable disease. I think we're really trying to cure a preventable disease. I'll give you examples. Polio, We don't cure. Even today, we don't cure, but we have a vaccine, and the world is largely free of polio. There are only 3 people in the entire world who've ever been cured of HIV. They had transplant of cells that were resistant to infection by the HIV virus. But we treat people with HIV, and we prevented tens of millions at least, of people with HIV through a simple condom. I think we're missing the great opportunity here is to prevent brain diseases, whether that's autism and intellectual disabilities, whether that's ALS, whether that's Parkinson's or Alzheimer's and seniors. I think these diseases fundamentally are preventable, and we're missing a huge opportunity to prevent these diseases by trying to search for a cure. I'll also point out 2 other things about a cure. One, it's really, 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 really hard to cure something if you don't know what its cause is. In fact, I can't give you a really good medical condition that we know how to cure where we don't know its cause. So we can cure hepatitis C today, unimaginable, because we know it's a virus and that we do it. We can cure peptic ulcer disease because we know it's bacteria that are causing ulcers and not stress. So we can cure diseases once we know its cause. So if we figure out what the causes of Parkinson's are, and I think we have a really good idea what the likely ones are, I think that brings us one step closer to a cure. The other thing, it's really hard to cure a disease after it's killed off lots of nerve cells. So by the time someone's diagnosed with Parkinson's, 60% of the nerve cells in the part of the brain called the substantia nigra have died off. It's really hard to imagine giving a medication that's going to resuscitate those dead nerve cells. So I think we need to pay a lot of attention to trying to prevent it. 2, I think if we know what its causes are, we can at a minimum reduce our exposure to these toxins, and that might slow the rate of progression of the disease. And we know, for example, if you already have Parkinson's disease, that high levels of air pollution are associated with increased risk of hospitalization. So if you have Parkinson's already, or dementia with Lewy bodies, or Alzheimer's disease, I would be extra concerned about minimizing exposure to other chemicals that can harm the brain.
My last question for you is in relation to the book you've co-authored, Ending Parkinson's Disease. Could you talk to us about this and how people can get their hands on it? Because I believe for those in North America, you make this available to them for free.
Yes. So my great colleagues, Drs. Todd Scheer, Michael Oken, and Bas Bloom, and I wrote this book in 2020, came out in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the central thesis of the book is that Parkinson's is largely a man-made disease. And so we take you through stories, vignettes, everything from Rachel Carson to Dr. James Parkinson to we probably talk about Michael J. Fox. All the authors are donating all of our proceeds from the book to efforts to prevent and end the disease. And so you can purchase the book on Amazon or whatever your interest might be. And if people can't afford the copy of the book, we'll send them a copy for free. They can just email us at info@endingpd.org. We can especially do this in the U.S., and we try to do this even outside the U.S., but it's a little more challenging and costly to do so. But if people can't afford a copy of the book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, they can email us at info@endingpd.org with their mailing address, and we'll send them a copy. In addition, if you have a story, or if I got something wrong, or you can amplify, or you have a story about your experience with Parkinson's, we'd love to hear from you. And they can, again, just email us at info@endingpd.org. And if you the means, help us raise a little bit of money for Parkinson's, you can buy the book on Amazon or your favorite book sale, or even in the library.
Absolute pleasure having you on the podcast again, Dr. Ray Dorsey. We'll pop a link to your book and to those websites in the show notes of this episode. But great pleasure to have you again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, anytime.
Well, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Happy Habit podcast. If you liked it or any of the previous 400 plus, show your support. It's free. You can like, subscribe, share with other people who you think might enjoy these episodes too. Leave us a thumbs up, a positive rating on iTunes or on Spotify, and on YouTube. You can become a subscriber there too. You can leave a comment and click that bell notification for any future videos. Until next time, stay happy.